Alright, time for another draftphysics.com. Debatephysics.com also. Forgot to do this thing. Yeah, okay. Yeah, proper intro. Okay, it's almost proper. Anyway, just an update video. I'll just point out a few videos on the website in the past week, and some of them pretty good, and so I guess I should just point out that they exist on the website. You have to go to the description or look for the comment by me, and it has a list of the videos, blah blah blah, and most of them are appropriately titled and whatnot. So anyway, this last one I made yesterday was on the subject of these which way experiments, which are always kind of convoluted, and they always have to use some way to mark photons, and so they use things like polarization filters and different things. And there's all kinds of assumptions built into the experiment about how those filters work or what they do and whether they're 50-50 or not. And that's where all of this proof, okay, of some phenomenon, some statement they wish to make that they prove something is built on. You have to believe all of the assumptions. And so I would argue that they really don't understand how any of this stuff really works. They really don't know what polarization of light is, and it's sort of important. And then the whole idea of being in phase and out of phase. And the fact is polarization has something to do with phase, because you can understand if you spread light that the pieces of the light will arrive at the surface at a different time. So if something's traveling this diagonal distance, it's a longer distance than this distance, and so you break the phase of light through having it polarized too much or too little. That kind of argument. And that's really what's happening when you're going through these different kinds of filters, is you're just breaking the photons. The photons are still there. That's sort of what the filter thing proves, because you can put two filters together, get no light at all, and then put a third filter in and you get some of the light back, which just sort of obviously says, oh, you didn't really kill the light, you just changed it in some way where I can't see it anymore. And then you put a new filter back in that fixes what you broke, and now I can see it again. And so, that changes the whole theory. If you accept that argument that the photons aren't really destroyed, that they're just put into pieces, and you can reconstruct them as photons. So, it's a completely different argument in a sense, and it's a different premise for the experiment. So anyway, we'll just play a couple of clips out of this. This wasn't one of the most outstanding videos, but I'm just trying to get to that point, that what are you really detecting? Polarization, or are you actually changing the phase? So the argument is that you can put a filter in that spreads light, diffraction gradient, that actually physically makes the light go in different directions, or you can use a polarizing film, which really doesn't spread the light, just changes the phase. It slows the light down, you could argue, right? In terms of it changes the time the light takes to get from point A to point B, because it goes through a different amount of substance, and that difference in time changes the sequence of the pattern that is the photon. It's not very complicated, but it's a little complicated. People want to pretend it's not. Because of the change in the distance between the photons, that is, the photon from one surface, as point sources, and the photon from the other surface have a different path length, Right, so anytime you change the path of the photon, or the piece of a photon, you change its phase. Okay, the distance change equates into a change in timing. And polarization is also a change in timing. Alright, can be a change in timing. The photon of the right frequency, because it's essentially jammed, you could argue. Right, so the question, the point is that there's our radar experiments, radio experiments, different experiments you could do where you're really showing that the geometry for jamming a signal, that is, making the signal indecipherable, is the same as some theory of destroying the energy. So making it indecipherable is the same thing as destroying in appearance, but the two theories are completely different. So I would just argue for there is pretty solid evidence that you don't really destroy photons, you just make them unresolvable, invisible. Experiments are doing exactly the same thing. All they're doing is creating sources, point sources. Right, so in all of the cases where you bend a light, it's point sources, where you just made a new source where the light can go in any direction through scatter. Or you have a case where you put the light through a transparency that seems to be benign, but what it's really doing is changing the phase. It's causing a phase shift, and that's what thin films do. So every time you create another layer of something for something to go through, you're potentially making photons that would be compatible, pieces of photons, incompatible, or vice versa. Alright, it's probably enough on that subject. It's kind of complex, blah blah blah. Yeah. Alright, this one, physicists are really stupid. I just think it was a good general argument about bullshit. Okay, so there's a couple of simple arguments I'm making about kinetic energy being just a fake notion. There's no reason to square the velocity. Acceleration isn't, if I say something is accelerating at 7 miles an hour, I don't say 7 miles an hour squared. There's no reason to square any part of something's velocity. As if that proves kinetic energy when the whole argument... Right, so somebody just posted the free fall rate of an object, and so what? That doesn't prove the existence of kinetic energy in any way whatsoever. It doesn't show that it takes 4 times as long for something to fall 4 times the distance, because it doesn't take 4 times as long. It only takes twice as long. It doesn't show that it's going 4 times faster, because it doesn't go 4 times faster. It only goes twice as fast. So even though it fell twice the distance, it's only going twice as fast. Momentum works. So what they have failed to do is produce any experiment in the history of mankind where momentum can't be used as an explanation. Momentum is what the universe runs on. It doesn't run on this fake, phony kinetic energy nonsense. And again, they never deal with the two big arguments I've provided, which is the hydraulic argument, where all hydraulics basically proves you can't have kinetic energy because it would be a free energy machine. Every pressurized vessel would be a free energy device. And the lever. Levers would be free energy devices. And he says, here's a paradox for you. Somehow my fuel gets more powerful the faster I'm going. Right, so that it creates these idiotic notions that somehow, I'm in a rocket, and the faster and faster I go in the rocket, the more my fuel can do. Somehow my fuel has more power because I'm moving. It's just nonsense. It's real nonsense. The velocity, it's going to move with twice the velocity of whatever pressure I put in here. I'm going to get twice the... So this is a simple pressure argument that I can put the 10-ton train in here and I'll get a 5-ton train out this other side. So I can put a 10-ton going 5 miles an hour. I'll get a 10-ton going, I'll get a 5-ton going 10 miles an hour. It's an easy conversion. The two things have exactly the same amount of energy. No experiment shows they have different amounts of energy. It's just fake and phony, and it's a lie to say that the kinetic energy theory makes any sense at all, because it doesn't. In the real world, it doesn't make any sense. It's the time, not 2 times the time. But if I free fall, it's twice the time, and that's all it's going to take. Right, so if I go down a staircase and I drop it, and then I drop it, and then I drop it, and then I drop it, it'll take me 4 times as long to get it to the ground. If I just let it fall, it'll fall twice in just twice the amount of time. Because that's what it's doing. It's collecting energy as it falls, at a rate. Okay, and in 2 seconds, you collect twice as much energy. You don't collect 4 times as much energy. It's only twice. Twice the exposure to the sun, twice the sunburn. Gravity's a real force. You're exposed to the real absence of the force, the deficit in the force, and that's what's pushing you into the earth. The real deficit. convoluted that what it's actually doing is it's processing the sun. Okay, so that's something about Einstein's mathematics being superior to Newton's in some way, and you know, it can be argued that the only way Einstein got the orbit of Mercury correct was just to contrive mathematics to create that event, that answer, and that the mathematics he contrived really just processes the source. You process the source of the gravity, that is, you wobble the source of the gravity, you wobble everything else. And obviously the thing's closer, a lot closer. Mercury happens to be a lot closer than any of the other planets. You know, it's really kind of in an unusually close orbit. Yes, it will be wobbled more than any of the other planets. Therefore, any theory or any mechanism you use to create the abnormality in the precession of Mercury, you can create it by just wobbling the sun. It's just a fact. You know, nonsense. The spaceship argument's a good one. Right. So I've been over all these arguments. There's been no reply to any of them. No explanation for how I can fire a gun and somehow it's still, Newton's laws are still valid, and somehow I have 1,000 joules of energy coming out of one end and I only have 1 joule of energy coming out of the other end. It's nonsense. It doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. Bullets do not make 1,000 gun recoils worth of energy. You can't argue that the bullet has the same energy as 1,000 gun recoils. No, it has the same energy as 1 gun recoil. Arguments. Alright, this might not be loud enough actually for you, so I probably should have turned that up, and I should have turned this down. My bad. Well, we'll see how bad it is actually. Probably have to change it again for each video. Alright, so on to the next one, which is called To the Gatekeepers, and that's really what this is all about. Okay, is that all these talking heads are controlling the physics agenda, controlling the conversation, controlling what is a real subject, and they don't want to make kinetic energy a real subject. They don't want to make particle theories of how photons work a real subject. They want to just keep pretending that their wavy, gooey, wooey, mushy physics is the only physics there is. And it isn't the best or the only explanation. It's just one version, and it's pretty much just dogmatic religion, because they'll never show you the evidence. They'll never show you why they believe this crap. Alright. You know, and if you start rotating them, once it's spinning like a flywheel, and you start changing the pitch on them, then it's going to be a fan, your flywheel. Right, so that's the whole Veritasium made a subject out of this stupid car that goes faster than the wind. And when you really analyze it and figure it out, that they're changing the pitch on the fan blades. I mean, if I have no pitch on fan blades, you can understand that they're completely neutral. So yeah, they're basically just pieces of sailcloth. And so I have a sail, and something you can push on, but the wind could push on it, and it doesn't cost you anything. And you know, so then if I tie the wheel rotation to rotating that big flywheel, it's just a flywheel now. If there's no pitch on the blades, it's just a flywheel. So I store energy in the flywheel, and then I pitch the flywheel. Well, now I turn the stored energy of the flywheel into motion, into pressure, air pressure, and I increase the velocity of the car. Pretty easy to understand if you understand it, if you go through it, because the logic is wrong. Because if you think of it as point sources, and then you move them together. Yeah, so you want to understand how you get 2 single slits, and you push them together, and you make a double slit, and you get a wholly different pattern. Well, you understand it because what you've done is create completely different distances between point sources. So if you understand the slit to be 2 point sources, 2 surfaces, and you're going to add some other surfaces, well, obviously it matters that you've added surfaces that are really far apart, that's going to make a huge difference in the pattern you're going to get. And that's the big difference. That's why the double slit looks different, and it's just so obvious and clear. This is about creating point sources. That's the 2-source experiment is the single slit. The 4-source experiment is the double slit. This fact is a fact. Okay, this one's well supported, undeniable. It is the right answer, and the meme engine, the gatekeepers, won't let that fact be heard. And it's so obviously a truth. It's about point sources. The surfaces create little sources of new photons. And those new sources create all the fringe pattern. All the fringe light is created by photons that interacted with the surface. Fact. That they won't let be heard. Something with a 2 velocity. Have all the same masses, so this will be twice. So here's the pressure argument again. Okay, no matter how you draw the pressure argument, it works. Okay, that's just, you can't deny that the fluid pressure system has very low losses. Okay, so I can compress a fluid, and there's very little heat. It creates very little losses, and I can convert 5-ton trains going 10 miles an hour into 10-ton trains going 5 miles an hour. And more importantly, I can do the reverse. I can convert the low energy by kinetic energy theory, the half as much energy, into twice as much energy. And obviously that can't happen in reality. That's a fallacy. That's nonsense. And it proves 1/2 mv squared can't be the truth. Impossible. Garbage. Mass over here. So anyway, scrutiny. And you find that this is true of a lot of the Galileo types and the rest of them. They weren't impressed. So a lot of them in their writings warn about buying into the conventional crap, because the conventionalists are dogmatic, and they've made mistakes, and they want to make their mistakes permanent. And they warned of this stuff, the Descartes, even the Newtons. They weren't conventionalists. They weren't convinced that everything was already solved and they had right answers. They were kind of convinced quite oppositely. And physics today doesn't seem to have that attitude at all. They think they have the right answers, and they don't. It's obvious that, well, what's happening when the force pushes? Well, it's pushing on this side in this direction, right? And it's pushing on this side in this direction. Well, what is okay, yeah, well, so it's just the argument about how you end up with balances in the system, and then you just creates an imbalance. It's a push universe, and all you're saying when something moves is you've taken away the push. Okay, you don't have as much push, or you've added push, but it's always just push. There's no pulls anywhere. Right? There's nothing there. So it has to happen with some sort of regularity. And so the idea is a clump. So it's making the argument that a photon can't be understood as just a ball. There's a photon. I've described it. A photon is an event. It's created over a period of time at the speed of light. Electricity moves through something, and it creates photons. Photons are timed sequences of code. The code travels through the space as a compression in a field of pressure, of little bits of energy. I move my hand forward, I compress all the light in front of my hand, and you'll actually get more light because my hand moved forward, compressed the reflections, and created more reflections in the direction my hand's moving. And if I reverse it and move the other way, I create less reflections. Just a fact. Like per 1,000 miles, like every 1 in every 1,000 or every 10,000 miles, it's perfectly conceivable that by traveling that far, every single photon would have, every bit of the energy would have hit an electron. Okay, so you may just make the argument about light traveling through empty space, that the probability is just, yes, there's certain parts of empty space that aren't completely empty, and that over time each photon would inevitably have encountered a certain number of electrons through its travel, and in that process it's redshifted. So their whole theory of universal expansion is basically based on one fact, redshift. And redshift can be explained as, yes, over great distances, light doesn't get a free ride. It does crash into crap, and as it crashes into it, it's degraded in its frequency. Space, one of the experiment that made Einstein. Without it, he would have been... Right, and so now it's the Eddington experiment that they've never redone from space with 400 times better resolution. No logical person can defend this. We have the technology to do the experiment 400 times with 400 times better clarity, and we don't do it. A critical experiment. Regarding a very critical, it'd just be great for us all to be able to see it even, right? Because the other experiments, it's all takes, you have to look at little blurry blobs and there's no easy visualization. Well, NASA could do it and give us a videotape of it and see the actual light, the effect of the light bending, and we could see the object move erratically and all that kind of stuff, and they don't do it. 50 years of conquering space, and they haven't taken a camera and taken a picture next to the sun. It's a ridiculous that hasn't been done by NASA. No eclipse needed. It takes 10 minutes to do the experiment, and they've never done it. And we're supposed to believe that's credible. No, it's not credible. Alright, this was a response to an A-level physics video, I think on photons, but I don't think it was anywhere on the subject, frankly. So I'll probably get to that in here somewhere. Don't totally recall the video. Alright, so he's just trying to ascertain, a formula for predicting the fringe spacing. So there's no chance. Right, okay, so there's no chance he's going to get the right answer if he uses the real double slit. So he's not going to use the real double slit because he's going to make the point sources, he's going to make the slits so thin that the point sources are irrelevant. They're the same point source. You can't draw a line from the 2 point sources and have those lines be a wavelength of difference because the 2 point sources are so close together. So you can't create an on-off. You can't create an out-of-phase, in-phase pattern because there aren't enough opportunities to create the pattern. So of course the math works, but it's the math of the single slit. It's not the math for the double slit. So this is one of the biggest frauds they commit, is to apply mathematics that describes a pattern that doesn't exist. The double slit pattern is distinctive, and they just they evade having to analyze it because their theory is wrong. It's not, 2 waves cannot explain the double slit. Impossible to explain it with 2 waves. You have to have 4 sources. Fact, 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 fact. Make a wavelength of difference. See, if I have 2 point sources that are smaller than a wavelength of difference, you can understand if I have a base of a triangle that small, I can't make the triangle in any direction where the 2 lines have much difference in their length. The difference in the length of the lines is dependent on how big the base is. So if I make a little tiny base, I have no hope of making a triangle with a hypotenuse that is much larger than the side. I have no hope of making the wavelength of difference. The more point sources, the more opportunity for constructive, destructive landing interference. More locations where the line to the point sources is a wavelength of difference. I have to have wavelengths of difference in the base of the triangle to have any hope of having a wavelength of difference in the length of the lines created by that base. Basic geometry. These 2 distances, there's different distances in here, but if I take the longest and the shortest distance, so the longest, the widest distance between 2 point sources obviously gives you the biggest base for a triangle, obviously gives you the most opportunity to create wavelength, full wavelength differences, more bars. So if I want to know how many bars I can create, I just count how many wavelengths fit in the base of the triangle. The number that fit in the base of the triangle will tell me exactly how many of these little notches, how many of these on-off sets I'm going to get here. But you know, it's really this biggest distance is making the little bars. You can understand that the further the distance between 2 point sources, 2 light bulbs, the furthest they are apart, okay, the more wavelengths of difference, right? The more places I can find where the 2 lines have a different length. You know, obviously. 2 point sources. He's saying there's only 2 sources in this experiment. Right, so he's doing the double slit and analyzing it as a single slit, because he's just basically destroyed 2 of the point sources by making them so close together they're irrelevant. And he's clearly cheating because he's using a mathematical averaging that nobody else uses, which is he's not measuring the length of the impediment. He's vaguely identified the variable as, well, it could be the length of the impediment or it could be the center of the opening. But again, if it's the center of the opening, he's just made the 2 slit in the experiment into the single slit. So if you do the mathematics from the center, yeah, you've just made a double slit into a single slit. You've turned it into a 2 wave when it's got to be a 4 wave to be a double slit. So of course your math will predict a single slit pattern. It will not predict a double slit pattern. So if you make those openings wide enough, his mathematics completely fails. It'll get completely wrong answers. So he's teaching math that gets completely wrong answers. You won't be able to physically duplicate it with an experiment. The experiment will not come out as his predictions. It's completely wrong, and yet he's a teacher. And so now the fringes will be less strong because I'm only receiving the periphery light from the source. I'm not receiving the strongest light from the source. I was just talking about the fact that the impediment obviously degrades the number of photons you're going to get in the double slit because you're blocking the strongest light. But that's not a very big point, but it's a point. It's too bad everybody's migrating towards this Twitterverse. It's really going to destroy all kinds of intelligent conversation. It's just, you know, this short video crap, everything has to be, you know, and these are real subjects. You can't deal with these real subjects in 5 minutes or 2 minutes, or, you know, it just ain't practical. It isn't realistic. It isn't rational. And it's very bad that people are falling into this pattern of trying to make everything into some sort of plastic toy, you know. And that's the simple truth. Alright, so I mean, if they measured just heat, you know, they'd probably find no pattern. Right, so the point is that if you really understand what's going on here, you'll figure out that the photons are not destroyed, they're just broken. And that their momentum, their real energy, still hits the target. It just doesn't, you're not going to see it as a photon. Just like the light still goes through the polarizing filters, you just don't see it as a photon, but it's still real energy. The polarizing film doesn't get hot. It's not killing photons, it's not blocking photons, it's not stopping photons. So you kind of have to understand that the energy still is going to the target and it's hitting all the locations. It's just in some places it's still broken parts, and in some places it's a car. Some places it's just fenders and steering wheels and shit, and in other places, yes, you can recognize it as a car. Simple point being made. Alright, it's probably enough. The other one's on waves as a generality, and I've already kind of covered that so many times that there's just so many good arguments of way you can just say waves just isn't very practical. Waves happen in mediums. Mediums have to have rules for there to be waves, because waves are basically just built on the fact that you're creating an oscillator. You have to shove the energy into some kind of storage device. It pushes the energy back down again, so gravity is the oscillator, the rubber band that makes it possible for water waves to work. Water waves wouldn't happen without gravity. Blah, 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 blah. Alright. So anyway, till the next time and such. I think that's enough. And, yeah, that's enough. So, yeah, that's enough. Alright, so this has been a draftphysics.com, debatephysics.com also. But gotta find somebody to debate. I guess I'll have to just make up debatables, you know. So I guess that's what it'll have to come to. I'll have to play their part for them. So maybe I'll do that in the next videos. See how it goes. And such.